Tinubu's fuel policy, government gains, but are Nigerians paying the price? Former Cross River State Governor and presidential candidate of the People's Redemption Party, Donald Duke, has injected fresh political energy into one of the most contentious economic debates in Nigeria: whether President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's economic reforms are truly rescuing the country or simply transferring the burden of government's financial problems to ordinary citizens. Duke's argument is straightforward but politically potent. In his view, the federal government may be earning more money following the removal of the petrol subsidy and other reforms, but Nigerians are not experiencing a corresponding improvement in their standard of living. His criticism comes at a crucial moment as the country moves deeper into the political atmosphere ahead of the 2027 general election. The economy is increasingly becoming the central battleground between the Tinubu administration and its opponents. The question confronting Nigerians is no longer simply whether the reforms were necessary. It is whether the sacrifices demanded from citizens are producing benefits they can actually see and feel. When President Tinubu announced on May 29, 2023 that subsidy is gone, his administration immediately placed Nigeria on a new economic path. The government's argument was that the petrol subsidy had become financially unsustainable, wasteful, and vulnerable to abuse. International financial institutions had also repeatedly argued that the subsidy consumed enormous public resources and disproportionately benefited wealthier Nigerians who consumed more fuel. The World Bank estimated that the subsidy had imposed a huge fiscal burden on Nigeria, costing the country about 2.2% of GDP in 2022, while projected fiscal gains from subsidy removal and related reforms were expected to create significant additional resources for government. The bank also warned, however, that without adequate compensation and social protection, many households could be pushed deeper into poverty by higher energy and transport costs. This is where Donald Duke's criticism becomes politically significant. Duke is not merely saying that petrol has become expensive. His broader argument is that an economic policy cannot be judged only by how much revenue it generates for government. It must also be judged by what happens to the people. If government revenues improve, foreign reserves strengthen and fiscal deficits narrow, but households continue to struggle with food, transportation, rent, electricity and other basic needs, then the political question becomes unavoidable. Where exactly is the dividend of the reform? That is the challenge at the heart of Duke's intervention. Duke described the previous subsidy regime as a scam, but argued that it had been replaced with another poorly managed arrangement that benefits government while impoverishing citizens. His argument reflects an important shift in the national debate. The argument is no longer simply whether the old subsidy regime was sustainable. Even many critics of the Tinubu administration acknowledged that the previous subsidy system was deeply flawed. The new debate is whether the government has successfully converted the resources supposedly freed by subsidy removal into visible improvements in the lives of Nigerians. That distinction is important. A government can be correct in identifying a bad policy and still face criticism over the way it manages the transition away from that policy. The removal of subsidy was economically defended as a way of freeing resources for infrastructure, health, education, social protection and productive investment. But for many Nigerians, the immediate reality has been a dramatic increase in the cost of transportation and a rise in the general cost of living. And because fuel affects almost every sector in the economy, the impact extends beyond filling stations. Transporters pay more, farmers pay more to move produce, manufacturers face higher energy and logistics costs. Traders pay more to move goods. Families spend more on transportation and alternative power. Those additional costs eventually find their way into the prices paid by consumers. This is why the petrol debate in Nigeria is not just about the price displayed at filling stations. It is fundamentally a debate about the entire cost structure of the economy. One of the strongest arguments against Duke's position is that the Tinubu administration inherited an economy facing serious fiscal and foreign exchange pressures, and that difficult reforms were unavoidable. The International Monetary Fund has acknowledged that Nigeria's macroeconomic reforms helped support economic activity and confidence, while growth was estimated at 4% in 2025. The IMF also noted that inflation had declined for more than a year before global fuel and food pressures contributed to renewed increase in early 2026. Similarly, the World Bank has said Nigeria's reforms helped improve government finances, although it has continued to stress that the benefits of macroeconomic stabilization must be translated into inclusive growth and stronger protection for vulnerable citizens. This presents the Tinubu administration with a political communication problem. The government can point to improved fiscal indicators, it can point to reforms in the foreign exchange market, it can point to economic growth, it can point to increased investor confidence, but the average Nigerian asks a different question. Has my life improved? That is the gap Donald Duke is trying to exploit. Economic reforms are often measured through indicators such as fiscal deficit, reserves, revenue inflation and investment. Ordinary citizens, however, tend to measure the economy through the price of food, transport fares, rent, school fees and the amount left in their pockets at the end of the month. If those two realities do not meet, fiscal resistance to reforms will continue. Duke's strongest political point is his suggestion that government may be financially benefiting from the reforms without Nigerians seeing a proportional improvement in public welfare. Recent statements from government have themselves intensified that debate. Nigeria's finance minister said in July 2026 that savings associated with subsidy removal and foreign exchange reforms had been substantially absorbed by increased debt servicing, cuts and higher government expenditure. That revelation raises a difficult question. If Nigerians have endured the pain of reform, how much of the resulting fiscal space has actually been converted into services and investments that directly improve their lives? This does not necessarily mean the reforms failed, but it reinforces Duke's broader argument that increased government revenue by itself is not enough. Citizens need to feel what the sacrifice has produced: better roads, more reliable electricity, improved schools, functional hospitals, effective transportation systems, expanded social protections, more jobs, and stronger purchasing power. Without these visible outcomes, government may continue to win arguments with economic statistics while losing the political argument in markets, motor parks and households. Perhaps the greatest challenge to the government's reform narrative is poverty. The IMF estimated that poverty had reached 63% under Nigeria's national poverty line, while millions of Nigerians continue to face food insecurity. The IMF also warned that higher fuel and food prices could further increase hardship. The World Bank has similarly warned about the scale of poverty and the failure of incomes to keep pace with the cost of living, stressing the importance of stronger social protection and inclusive growth. This gives Duke's criticism considerable political weight. A reform program can be economically rational and still produce severe social consequences if its benefits takes too long to reach citizens. This is the danger facing the Tinubu administration. The government argues that Nigeria is now on a more sustainable path. Critics argue that sustainability cannot mean the government finances improve while households become poorer. Both arguments can contain elements of truth, and that is why the debate is unlikely to disappear. However, Donald Duke also faces a major burden. It is not enough for opposition to say that Tinubu's policies are anti-people. Nigerians will increasingly demand to know what the alternative is. Would the PROP restore a broad fuel subsidy? Would it introduce a targeted subsidy? Would it impose price controls? Will it reduce taxes on fuel? Would it increase direct cash transfer? Would it prioritize domestic refining and lower logistics costs? Would it redesign the entire structure of government spending? These are the details that will determine whether Duke's criticism develops into a credible alternative economic agenda. Duke had said the PROP would strengthen the foundations of the economy through what he described as imaginative scrutiny, enlightened policies, and greater attention to the livelihoods of Nigerians. But as 2027 election approaches, broad principles will have to become concrete policy proposals. The opposition's challenge is therefore twofold. First, it must convince Nigerians that the current policies are failing them. Second, and more importantly, it must convince Nigerians that it has better and financially sustainable alternative. That second task may be more difficult. There is also a major economic warning against simply reversing Tinubu's policies. Nigeria's former fuel subsidy regime was widely criticized for encouraging inefficiency, corruption, and smuggling while placing enormous pressure on public finances. The World Bank described the system as fiscally unsustainable and regressive. Therefore, the answer may not be a return to the old subsidy structure. The more difficult question is whether Nigeria can design a better system, a system that prevents government from paying unsustainable subsidies, a system that reduces the cost of domestic refining, a system that improves public transportation, a system that supports the poorest households directly, a system that reduces the cost of moving food and goods across the country, a system in which citizens can clearly see how public resources are being used. That may be the real policy conversation Nigeria needs. Duke's intervention should also be understood in the context of the approaching presidential election. The economy is rapidly becoming the major referendum issue against President Tinubu. Recent international reporting has noted that while the administration's reforms have received support from investors and international financial institutions, they have also intensified the cost of living crisis and generated widespread public frustration. This creates both an opportunity and a danger for the opposition. The opportunity is obvious. Hardship provides a powerful political message. The danger is equally obvious. Public dissatisfaction does not automatically produce electoral victory, particularly if opposition parties remain fragmented and fail to present a convincing common alternative. For Tinubu, the political challenge is equally clear. By 2027, Nigerians may be less interested in explanations about why the reforms were necessary in 2023. They will want evidence that the pain produced results. The president's strongest argument will be that the difficult decisions prevented a deeper economic crisis and created the foundation for future growth. His critics will respond that Nigerians cannot continue living on promises of future benefits while struggling with present hardship. That is likely to become one of the defining arguments of the election. Ultimately, Donald Duke's criticism is bigger than petrol. Fuel has simply become the symbol of a much larger economic argument. It is about whether economic reforms are designed around government balance sheets or human welfare. It is about whether improved revenue is being converted into better public services. It is about whether economic growth is creating jobs. It is about whether poverty is falling or rising. And above all, it is about whether Nigerians believe that their sacrifices are producing a better future. Duke's statement may therefore resonate because it captures a frustration felt by many citizens. Government keeps announcing economic progress, but the cost of survival remains painfully high. The Tinubu administration can respond that the reforms are beginning to stabilize an economy that was heading towards deeper crisis. The opposition can argue that stabilization without shared prosperity is not enough. The World Bank and IMF evidence suggests a more complicated reality. Nigeria has made progress in macroeconomic stabilization, but poverty, food insecurity, and the cost of living remain serious challenge. That is the contradiction at the center of Nigeria's economic debate. The government says the medicine is working, the people says the pain is still unbearable, and as 2027 approaches, Nigerians will increasingly ask the most important question of all. After all the sacrifices, who has really benefited from the reforms? Is it the government, the economy, or the ordinary Nigerians? Please subscribe to Nigeria Way for more in-depth analysis.